Good morning, everyone. We're probably going to crack into it pretty quickly because we're almost at time for Andrew's presentation. So if I could just get you all to check you're muted, just keep it muted, and there'll be a section for questions at the end of his presentation if you've got any that you want to ask. So without any further ado, I'll jump into Andrew. So Andrew's going to be presenting on asset management plans. Andrew is an expert advisor with over 27 years experience in infrastructure, investment planning, asset management, strategy, and regulatory design. His experience spans electricity transmission, electricity and gas distribution, telecommunications, and energy markets. He holds an honours degree in electrical engineering from Canterbury University and an executive MBA from Queensland University. Andrew has represented the New Zealand Electrical Engineers Association on a joint Australian-New Zealand Standards Committee for Demand-Side Management and has been a member and chair of multiple New Zealand electricity industry working groups. Andrew is a member of the Institute of Asset Management. Andrew co-founded Partner Consulting Group based in Wellington, and they bring extensive experience in asset management, investment planning, and regulatory design, working within and across organisations and sectors. Last year, Partner completed a review of distribution company AMP and risk preparedness. So when you're ready, Andrew, we'll jump into your presentation.
Well, good. Thank you, Andrew, for the introduction. Much appreciated. And it's awesome to see so many people, albeit virtually. It's a very, I guess, unique year, isn't it? But I have to say I'm very grateful for being in New Zealand at this time. I'd see, one thing's for sure though, that I think over the next 12 months, things are going to change again with all the vaccine announcements that we've been having recently, which is great to see. But I was just thinking the other day, that all these, with these announcements around vaccines, that there's been, such innovation and such change and continuous development, like in a really short space of time. It's a real example, real world example of innovation and change and development and things like that. So, while we're talking about AMPs and asset management plan and, and things like that today, we're not talking about world-saving vaccines. I think the thing of innovation and change and development is real applicably to what we're doing. So I think within that context, I just wanted to talk to you today about some work we did last year, as Andrew said, for the Commerce Commission, around looking at AMPs and looking at risk and resilience, and some learnings that we potentially, I can give you some tools and things to think about for your own organisations. So I'm just going to start this presentation. Hopefully you can see it. Oh, not like that. Let me get this technology right. Sorry, guys. Here we go. Here you go. Can you see that? Yes.
That's good.
Yes.
Yep.
That's all good. Very good. Cool. So, as I say, I want to talk to you today about sort of risk and resilience and some work we did with the Commission, or for the Commission last year. Before I start, I just wanted to say that some caveats. Firstly, I'm not talking on behalf of the Commission. This is our own views and the conclusions that we came to as a result of from the work we did. Secondly, I wanted to say that, as I said, the purpose of this really is to highlight and to encourage good practice in regard to AMPs. And so please take it in that context. That was our purpose, right? So if I just quickly go through to here. So what I want to talk about in regard to the studies, give you a brief overview about the scope of what we did, some of the review questions that the Commission were interested in, and then also how we looked at it and what we did for the when we look at AMPs and our findings, and then lastly a summary. Wrong way. Very briefly, we've just been doing, as Andrew said, we've been doing this. I've been doing this for a while. 2004, we set up across multiple industries. I won't dwell on that. In terms of the review, what we did was our scope really was looking at AMP disclosures, and from an interested person's perspective, which I find is always interesting because, you know, we're writing these things so that stakeholders can see and understand and have a look at what we do. And we were looking with a focus on risk and resilience and help planning. It was a desktop review only. So in a top-down review, you can imagine there's 29 AMPs between 300 and 400 pages each. So it certainly wasn't bottom up, let's look at all the risk and resilience. So it was a top-down view based on 2018 and 2019 AMPs. And as I said, we looked at risk and resilience. This was sort of specified down to some more specific. So looking at really risk management practices from a corporate perspective, and help response planning, and then some resilience investments that we could see how people disclosed. What wasn't included is the asset related risks. I find that once you go into this risk space, you can go down a rabbit hole quite quickly. So we were had to be quite specific about what we looked at. And on the bottom of the presentation here, I've got a link to the actual document as it was published. Just some context for it. The Commerce Commission issued an open letter in November 2017, and in there they talked about the asset management being a key focus, and ability to manage assets to maintain resilient networks, and to do both of these in a changing environment. I guess we've seen even this year, right? So a changing environment, slightly different, changing from what you might think about from a physical perspective, but you know, we've had a new take on resilience this year, I think, as we've seen firsthand. This study was seen as a step towards that. But the point I wanted to make more specifically was that, as we all know, right, risk is becoming an increasing area of interest, particularly resilience, and obviously from the Commission, but also I've seen from Audit New Zealand, who review local government things and government agencies as well. They're particularly interested in risk and resilience and what's happening and how people are treating it inside their businesses. So this is an area I think that's going to not go away. It's an area of growth, and as people think about, you know, how they deal with it in their businesses. So just our approach to how we'd looked at it. So we were looking at, because AMPs, right, you've got these layers of detail, if you like. So obviously they consist of the business has to do things first. You put things in place and practices, and then of course you write about them, right? So you've got multiple layers of things. And so what we were looking for AMPs was whether the actual demonstration of good risk governance and processes, demonstration of help, right, and when descriptions of what people actually invested in. So I mean, it's easy. One thing I was thinking about, it's easy to write about theory, but really what we're looking for is in the review was actual descriptions of what people had actually done, and through these AMP processes, though, you know, we often talk about journeys. There's always a journey. It's easy to write about theory, but to actually layer onto it what you actually do and how you do it is an important aspect to it. I have this interested persons test in my own mind. It involves both clear communication and demonstration that you've actually applied a sort of systematic and ongoing practical application within your business. So it's quite, you know, this whole layer, as well as demonstration about the technical standards and then what you've actually done, as I say, multiple layers. We're talking about risk. So I did get a quote from the 31,000 standard, right? So it says, for risk management to be effective, an organisation should at all levels comply with the principles. And I've just picked a few things like integral part of organisational process, systematic, structured, is based on best available information, is dynamic, iterative, and responsive. So in my mind, risk is actually, it's a system. You have to deal with it as a system. And so when we're looking at this review, we have to think about what is the system, what is the pieces that are in place, and then of course how it's described in the AMP. I think because we've got a breakout session next about AMPs and what good AMPs look like, I thought I'd throw a couple extra slides in here around that. So when we're doing this review, though, we have to think about, as I said, we have to think about what AMPs actually do and what they are. So there's always 4 components to AMPs. There's a slightly different take on it. Perhaps give you something to think about when you're writing yours. But there's obviously a regulatory element around the things that you have to meet in terms of ID disclosures. And then, of course, we're writing for stakeholders, so there's a clear English aspect to it. And then an important part is obviously being professional, application of standards, and one thing that often stands out is internal consistency. So it's about making sure that the data matches the commentary and the commentary matches the data and throughout. And then, of course, optimization about demonstration that you're developing over time and you're implementing what you say you're going to do. So, and then of course there's branding, right? So when we were reviewing AMPs and had a look at them, you have to take these elements into consideration. And then the other aspect of it is what sort of risk. And as I said, when you start talking about risk, people can wave their hands and talk about risk, right? But there's also lots of elements involved with risk. Obviously, I put the standard 31,000 diagram on the left there. But in doing the study, we had to make sure we define clearly what segments. It's quite, I don't know, I hope you can see it might be quite small, but effectively we layered up the elements of risk, and this is just a summary, of course, but we wanted to be clear that what we were doing and which elements we were dealing with. So in the study, as I said earlier, we were looking at risk processes and policies and around business continuity plans effectively from a top-down perspective. Oh, wrong way, sorry. And then, of course, within that as well, so it goes deeper again. The question is what drives resilience, and resilience, no doubt, is a function of the whole system. We've got this diagram here, and about there's different domains that contribute to it, and they all sit within an environment. But in our particular instance, we were looking at help contingency planning. So it effectively around what happens, or what are you planning around this sort of immediate aftermath of after an event, and how you respond to what's your planning around that, and to see if things are in place, and how have you reported that in the AMP, of course. So the review questions that the Commission was wanting us to look at was, what evidence, once again, I'm not going to read this in detail, but, what methods and conclusions are in place, what strategies and processes are in place, and, there's specific network areas, for example, identified. So the theme effectively is, the way I read it anyway, is that you're looking for evidence, looking for demonstration, and looking for application, right? So, and then the specific one at the end is around SPEAR strategy and how they're taken into account for help. So this is from a sort of development perspective. This is a line of sight question between the objectives for your your help event planning, and then the SPEAR strategy and the practical application on the ground. So if I just spend a bit more time on these things. So what we were looking for was, as I said earlier, around, once again, around the demonstration of specific things and how they've been described in the AMP or the AMPs. The three parts, of course, was risk policies, then and then help planning, and then risk and resilience. So this is the risk policies aspect of it, corporate risk policies. So the question was, do they AMPs disclose and do they demonstrate, right? The risk standard that's been applied or framework's been applied, the accountabilities, the scope, the policy objectives, and the processes used, right? And then, of course, the last point, which is the evidence of the systematic application. And generally, I find, like we've seen AMPs over the years, good examples are ones that are clear and concise. As I said, the theory and the application are woven together, and to demonstrate understanding about what it is actually. And the interested persons test, which is if you put yourself in a position of saying, well, if I'm obviously we're experts in this area, so to speak, in terms of asset management. So, but if you're not involved in the company and you're sitting out there and you're a customer, which lots of us are anyway, you pick this up and have a read of it. Does it actually tell you what you want to know? So that's my interested persons test, as I put it. And so what we found, this is not surprising, but that pretty much all EDBs appeared to have a form of risk management in place and or risk management policy in place. But there is quite a level or difference in how different companies disclose it, and the quality of the description does vary a bit between companies. One thing, as I said earlier about the consistency, sometimes in a few cases, right, we looked at AMET scores for individual questions that were relevant. And so in a few cases, the AMET scores seem to contradict the actual commentary itself. So that's just something to watch out for, I think. And then people disclosed the categories of risk and how they looked at them. They're quite similar across companies, which is not surprising, but there is some variation. And what we did was, the whole idea of this was to say, let's highlight some good examples so that people could follow them and have a look at them and learn from them. And so we've quoted them there, Alpine, North Power, Orion, etc. So I think there are some good examples out there you can have a look at if you're looking to develop your AMP. And the other thing is, though, I know Julian's talking later on about risk and asset health and things like that, so from a transport perspective. But one thing to note in the AMPs is that what I find is generally the actual relationship between the corporate-wide risk management and the treatment of network and asset-related risk isn't very well plotted out. And so there's I think there's a potential there for a scope for people to add that sort of thing to the AMPs. So in terms of help preparedness, what we found was the AMPs disclosed and demonstrated what we were looking for, was the purpose of each plan. Often, this is an area where you find that companies have they name plans differently, so there's not a lot of consistency between companies around this, but they cover the same sort of things, they just have different naming conventions, and often there's more than one plan that you find people have that covers help, risk, and response to emergencies. We were looking for, as well, as part of this process, looking for alignment with the standards, with business continuity standards, for example, accountabilities and roles and responsibilities, where they disclosed. One other thing is the objectives of the plan. So, if you're planning, you're putting resources in place. What are you planning to do? So, what is your response rate? For what do you expect, or how do you try and what's your basis for what you're doing in terms of putting people and spares and things on the ground? The other thing is the integration of asset management planning, including treatment spheres. We're looking for, particularly important is regular testing and improvements. Have these sort of things been disclosed in your AIM? And have you talked about it? And then, of course, the evidence of application of health analysis in terms of the specific risks that your network is faced with. As I say, the same good examples once again have the same sort of characteristics as we did before. And what we find is that you know, as I say, once again, the majority appear to have a form of emergency response in place. And as I said, there's a range of plans that people have, and however the disclosure, or the level of disclosure in AMPs and strategies and processes varies quite a lot. Some companies spell it out quite well, others don't really say that much about it. But as well, in everyone's CDMA Lifelines group member, which is not surprising, obviously. There are some key elements we've identified we think that would really strengthen the disclosure, and that is, as I said earlier, the overall objectives of these contingencies plans wasn't always described well in plans, and obviously it's a key part of planning to know what you're trying to achieve, and things like stakeholder views about what objectives you're looking to put in place. How long do people want to, you know, after an event, how long do you expect to be off for? And I know that depends entirely on the size of the event, but it's a question of what you're putting into your planning. Disclosure of risks, demonstration update, up-to-date, systematic analysis of help events around, or help risks around your region. The other thing I don't think I put it down here, is that different companies actually describe or have different thresholds for risk, help risk. So it might be worth having a think about that as well. And one key thing, I think I was talking to a friend of mine, for example, is he's a supply chain specialist, and they and he works for an aid organisation, and they go into places after big natural disasters and natural events. And he says to me, you know, one big difference is when plans work and when they don't, is when they're actually tested. People know what they're doing, and not just waiting to after the event. It's not just a piece of paper that sits in a drawer. So one important aspect of the disclosure we were looking for is, when was the plan last time tested? You know, how long ago was it? And how old is the plan? You know, did you actually review it recently and update it? So I think that's a key part of these help preparedness. And the last aspect, I'm rushing through this, sorry guys, I didn't, but that's all right, it's all good, trying to keep to time.
A little bit over 5 minutes there, all right?
Oh, perfect. The other aspect is resilience investments we were looking at. So are there specific investments in the AMP disclosed that relate specifically to resilient risks, and where they were described? So this, of course, you know, quickly merges into standard asset management. But what we found was that majority of AMPs generally refer to general investment principles rather than specific investments where they relate to resilience, which is unsurprising. They were generally, I think there were some themes across EDBs, right, in terms of resilience and investments. When they talk generally about it, it was things like seismic strengthening, replacing sort of larger pole mounted substations with ground mounted types and things like that. So there were some general themes. But one thing we were suggesting, or what we suggest, is that if you're talking about resilience investment specifically, that you're specific in terms of what you're saying. rather just general principles. It's not, sometimes if you're interested party to read the fact that you're just applying a standard network architecture, just like, well, it's not, that's interesting, but it's not, we know that's going to happen, right? So we suggest you be specific, but in the AMP, I wouldn't suggest you repeat what you've already said previously. At least just point to it and show where they are specific investment, resilience investments. And once again, what's the rationale for the level of investment is often not described. So people don't really, well, to date, they haven't really said, well, we're making this level of resilience investment for this reason. They're just usually, often it's just stated specifically. So I think there's a few things to think about in terms of disclosure about asset investments that are specific to resilience. Sort of, as I say, those are the key things. So we looked at, there's a detailed report we put together and published, the link earlier on, but just to summarize effectively, so disclosure of risk management policies and frameworks we reviewed, and we're really looking for, as I say, systematic application of them, and in the descriptions, the combination of theory and practice and how it's been applied. I think there's some potential benefit in strengthening up how contingency planning is actually described and presented with AMPs. And the other thing is more consistent, perhaps. Disclosure of resilience investments would be useful from an interested person's perspective within AMPs. So as I say, there's multiple layers in this sort of thing. There's actually what you do as a company, there's what you present in the AMP, and of course we were trying to go through those things and see, well, actually, okay, what is recommendations around what you present and how you present it, and hopefully, of course, that leads to encouragement of improving and innovation and continuous development within the companies as well. So so that's all I have. Hopefully that fitted with your time for me, Andrew.
No, you're looking good for time. We've got a few more minutes till we need to move on. So are there any questions from anyone in the forum today? Either unmute yourself and sing out and we'll get on to you, or you can hit the reactions button. I think you can chuck something up in the chat and we'll see it. So are there any questions from the floor at all? I can't see any response. Okay. Oh, yeah, here's one coming up. So we've got one from the chat from Dave Moore. Hi, Andrew. Great presentation. In your AMP review regarding risk, did you uncover any confusion or misalignment by EDBs between ISO 31000 and ISO 55000 requirements? Should EDB asset managers be familiar with both ISO standards from a risk management perspective?
So just, I guess my immediate response to that is that this alignment, right, between corporate risk policies, which ultimately the board is interested in, right, and then that which cover organization as a whole, it should certainly in AMP certainly be shown the mapping between that and then how you apply risk from an asset perspective, and linking. I think the more we can show how these things link in your AMP between 31,000 and that's applied to an asset management context for 55,000, it certainly would assist, right? And it may just assist to someone like me who's a geek, right? You kind of thinking about these things, but I think the clear communication of that would help a lot, and I think that gap is something that we should people should actually think about how you demonstrate it, and it helps both in a communication perspective internally as well, because often what you find is that you've got your risk guys on one side and you've got asset management guys on the other side, and they kind of don't quite mesh very well. So I certainly think that's an area of development that we could work on, right, as an industry. And should they be familiar with? Yeah, well, I think you should. Yeah, it's not the standards are not that hard to have a look at anyway. And end of the day, we're trying to manage risk around supply and delivery to our customers. So it all, in a practical sense, it ends up being the same thing, right? In terms of actually delivery of business services and to our customers. So yeah, I think it's a good thing to be aware of both, certainly.
Nice. Any other questions from the chat coming in? Is that coming out just yet? Oh, I've got a question for you.
Good.
You're talking about some good examples of disclosure that you saw. What really stood out with those as good examples? Was it a good discussion of like technical aspects, or was it just the way they communicated those thoughts in the asset management plan? What made them really good examples?
I think it's both, right? So one thing we noticed, right, with AMPs and people writing these things is that initially you always start with the theory, right? It's easy to write the theory, and then it's like the asset management journey. It's the same thing with AMPs and writing them. You start in a space, and then over time you layer in the actual practical application. So you have this mix between the theory and the standards and the things you're trying to, the good practice things, and then that's tempered with the practical reality in your particular circumstance, right? So you can usually tell the good examples have a mix of both, and they also then flavor in, well, we've done X, Y, and Z as well, and this is how we've moved over time. So I don't, it's not. I certainly don't expect people to put that sort of thing in, be able to do that in day one. But it certainly, because it always takes a bit of evolution and a bit of quite a, in terms of development of the actual communication piece as well. It does take a while, which is fine. So yeah, the good examples have all those combination of all those things in there.
We've got Julian Morden in to talk to us about risk management. So Julian is the manager of performance and risk at Transpower. Over the last 4 years at Transpower, Julian has developed organizational capability and the use of asset health, risk profiling, and system performance for investment planning. Prior to joining Transpower, Julian had 15 years experience with Melbourne Water and Yarra Valley Water and the various asset management roles across a diverse range of built and natural assets. So when you're ready, Julian, we'll hand over the reins to you and you can give your speech.
Kia ora, thanks Andrew. Can you see me now? There I am. Thanks for the introduction. Exciting time to be here and interesting to hear all the work that the EEA has done over the last year or so around some of the stuff that we're going to be talking about today. When I first came to Transpower about 4 years ago, I was in a team that was sort of trying to develop asset health and performance data more for the business so it can be included in decision making. And our mantra at the time was really around long-term value for New Zealanders and least life cycle costs, and to do that through like a systematic, repetitive way in our decision making, and to document that too in an AMP. And I think our mantra has changed a little. We've moved more to trying to explore risk-based decisions, and we're starting to look a little bit wider than just the asset or asset class lens, and starting to look into more system-wide impacts and major hazard or high impact, low probability risks. But it's still a long way to go, I think, for us. We're only, we've made some gains, but it's still just tipping into that area. But I think the important thing I wanted to underline before I jump into the presentation is some of that asset class view has set us up real well, because that's sort of like the basics that you got to get right, and then you can start to really fine tune it with risk. And start to look at generating more value and making decisions closer to or making more risk-based decisions that give you more value. So I really, what this presentation about is the journey that we've come over these last 4 or 5 years. So I'll jump into that now. Can someone just let me know if they can see that slide?
Yeah, you're looking good.
Sweet. Okay. So, and interesting because like many of you today are industry colleagues, some of it Transpower colleagues, but many of you are customers, and like we are managing the grid for risk, for service, for you, our customers, but also for wider New Zealand. So it'll be. I'm really interested in getting your perspective on some of the questions we've got coming out of this. So yeah, I'll be talking about risk-based asset management, but it'll also take us on the journey of where we've come from and where we're going. So context for Transpower, not dissimilar to probably some of the context for some of yourselves, but maybe a little bit different. We have a depreciated asset base. 60% of our conductors were installed between the 50s and 80s. So we've, if they all came to end of life at the same time, there's a big bow wave because it was a big build when the grid got established. Accelerated electrification, I'm sure that's maybe hitting some distributors as well as the transmission. The net zero carbon means things like electrifying heat, like process heat, and possibly, well, definitely vehicle changes in the future. So that's going to be an important factor for us going forward. Changing in transmission pricing methodology to beneficiary pays, that's a big one this year. That could magnify the affordability of energy for parts of New Zealand because some people's prices will go down, some people's prices will go up based on that methodology. Non-network alternatives are improving, so that means more stuff outside of transmission. So how do we factor that in? The whole thing of affordability isn't going away. We know that we've got to try and smooth that bow wave of all of our depreciated asset base and think smart about that. And we're a regulated state-owned enterprise, and we've got a 5-yearly reset. So that means we do our business planning year to year. 1-2 year business case cycles, but we develop a 5-year submission on price, and we have a 15-year asset management plan. We give a dividend to the government, and we have to be conscious of our price path, and therefore the whole thing around risk is a balancing act. I think the data and analytics that's happening in the industry is just starting out, and it's not a computer says scenario for us. We need to have that engineering judgment over the top, but with more information that and structured in a way that makes it really useful. That engineering judgment is a lot clearer and easier to be done, and then it becomes about adding value and packaging works, or future proofing, and looking at the sustainable plan rather than a peaky plan that gets us in trouble with a price pass for 1 5-year period and then flattens out the next. So I guess the question we find is, how do we reduce our risk levels, and for the dollars we invest, or even how do we get better bang for buck? Is probably the best way of putting it. So our core objective in Transpower and in grid development and asset planning is really around economically justified asset management to meet our overall strategic objectives. That's around lease life cycle costs, but it's also around acceptable risk profiles, and that's hard to get out of any board or to interrogate really easily. And sometimes it is about what's the change in risk over time. So what does good look like? The big part is being able to communicate this stuff, and I think that's what Andrew's discussion around what does a good AMP look like. It's being able to communicate those risks and manage those risks, and being able to develop programs of work that address it. We need to be able to confidently get plans that deliver on value. So in other words, making sure we meet energy affordability, but also being able to draw that connection into what's our risk profile, and also what's the service impact for customers. So about a year or so back, we sort of started to toy with this term of network risk. What is network risk? And there is no one metric or one dimension. So we developed the critical risks for power infrastructure. Now, Transpower and any business has more than just the infrastructure risks. It has financial risks, it has human capital, it has safety risks. It also has information infrastructure risks. So which there is more and more an overlap with power infrastructure as we move towards digital substations and the like. But if we just took power infrastructure risks alone and said, well, what's the circumplex? What are the variables in that? And so we have condition-based failures, things that fail due to degradation over time. And that's a lot of our work on asset health is about that. We also have environmental and seismic risks. We have specific risks like underclearances or earth potential rise or vegetation for power lines. We have station-specific risks where we have a risk that the station could catch fire or that there's some earthing problem there. We have third-party risks on transmission. It's a digger, it's hay, it's a tractor. Every year something runs into a transmission line, it seems like. We have delivery risks, things go wrong during projects and maintenance. And we also have this failure to manage change, particularly with generation being a real change for over time, and also the demand over time. So out of all these risks, condition-based failure, like in terms of interruptions, only 25 to 30% of our risk of interruptions to service is from condition-based failures. A lot of them are from these other risks, and how do we manage those? So we've been doing a bit of work on bow ties over the last few years, just trying to understand how say a transmission line, what are the major hazards and the asset degradation risks for transmission lines. We do the same thing for, say, substations and primary assets, HVDC, and going through this process opens the eyes sometimes in how strong are our controls on the preventative side, but also on the mitigative side. And Andrew talked about resilience, contingency planning, spares, all that stuff on the mitigation side is becoming more and more valuable, because it's harder sometimes to get the business cases up to engineer yourself out of a significant failure. How does all this risk come into our decision making. So we have a decision framework. This is a simplified version. We have a lot of data, and I think that's the first place you start. If you're trying to understand what's your asset health or what's your risk, have you got the data? Do you know you've got the assets? Do you know where they are? Do you know the master data? What type, what voltage, what make, what model, what year they're installed? Do you know the condition? All this stuff is so important to have to be able to make informed decisions. But you need all this other context as well. What customer projects are going on? What are the other major hazards that are happening? What's happening with the future design of the grid there? And then we end up with a whole heap of needs that we have to options assess. And then the last piece before we develop an AMP or a submission is, how do we prioritize the solutions? What if we were to spend 10% less? How would we prioritize those? I think we're at medium maturity for our replacement and refurbishment plans on this decision framework, but we're still trying to build maturity in maintenance planning and also in contingency planning. That's an area that we need to work on. So let's talk about asset health. I think our asset health journey sort of started with just condition. We just took a condition score on an insulator and then plotted it on a curve for this corrosion area, and that was it. And we've come a long way on health. We now have a 0 to 10 score for health rather than a remaining life of 15 years or 20 years. We have the systems to combine all that information and to output it. It uses more than just condition. It also uses other things like duty. The expected life piece is really the important part of it, and some of the work that's happened in forensics, in understanding poor performers and good performers, has been really, really good to set that life up. I think there's a hygiene factor, and when I talk about a hygiene factor, that's like the base level that keeps you satisfied, and it's normally talked about in terms of job satisfaction. But the base level of managing infrastructure, you have to sort of do the basics, otherwise you get dissatisfaction. And I think having a reasonable handle on your asset health and making sure you're investing in those areas is really the hygiene factor. We can convert health into a failure risk. So we do a probability of failure. So using international information or our own failure rates, we can plot a probability of failure curve for the various health scores. And then we need to understand what's the impact, because that's just a likelihood. So the impact or consequence is really asset criticality for us. And we've got 5 dimensions being service performance, public safety, worker safety, environment, and direct cost. And then we end up with a monetized risk. So to do criticality, we really tried to map, taking Andrew's point before, we tried to map the corporate risk matrix to get those values and to monetize it. And that really looks at the economic cost of unserved energy and things like serious harm or fatalities from public safety. And we went on a journey on this. You don't get there overnight. In 2012, we got so far with a one-dimensional ranking. 2014, 2-dimensional, and it was sort of like a high, medium, low approach. And really, I think there was some good work done in 2016 and 2015 around, is that going to work for us? Because we're finding lots of assets just slotted in the same high or medium, and you couldn't really differentiate the risk between one asset and the other. So then we went to a probabilistic monetized approach, and it's, you know, it's not perfect, but it's a good relative score that that helps us understand, you know, what the risk is of doing something or not through a delta. But the maturity journey is really important. It's as much about change management as it is about getting the data and the coding and the systems up. And it takes time. We're still working on it, and you know, what we really want to do is see what's behind the numbers and communicate that more effectively. Here's just a bit of a slide of how that risk could manifest in one view of, say, an asset class portfolio. The blue line, the left, the y-axis is a monetized annual loss, and the dark blue line is if you did nothing over 25 years on the x-axis, and the red line is if you spend, you know, I think 2% or 1% of the fleet, and the light blue line was what was proposed to be invested in. And obviously, after a certain period, it went up because we'd only had a number of investments. The other area we can visualize this sort of stuff is overall our condition-based failure risk. So this is like collectively we have about 160,000 assets now with a probability of failure and a consequence. Some of those consequences are quite large, like $1-2 billion, and we know they're not scaled right because value of loss load doesn't really work beyond 24 hours. So we need to get another metric there. But we know that these big ones out the right here, they're like lines crossing multiple lines, and if they all fail, you disconnect the North Island, or you have significant rolling outages. So each color here represents a different asset. You can move the color down as it goes up as it degrades, and when you replace it, it comes back down again. But you can't get rid of the risk; it's always there. It's just about managing it. And of course, with these big ones out the right, you can design, redesign, or duplicate, or work your way out of that, but it's normally very expensive. So that may be where mitigation comes in. Some of the other challenges we've had around aggregating risk: do you take the sum of all your assets on the line, or do you just look at the max on the line? So, Christchurch Twizel looks like our riskiest line if you took the sum. But then, maybe the max is Roxburgh Islington. If you just look at the worst asset on the line. So I think creating a network risk score for asset failure risk, ignoring all the other risks, is risky. I guess is a little bit short-sighted, but you need to be on top of it. But it's not the full picture of risk. So what else are we doing besides asset failure? We've been looking at major hazards. We're still developing a major hazards at site level, but you can see a chart here that shows various major hazards across our sites. Things like fire, flooding, sabotage, volcanics. These are all risks that we're trying to understand, seismic, and how do we mitigate those? And sometimes the options are only viable if there's something else going on, like growth or seismic plus flooding. But some of our sites may only have a 1 in 100 or 1 in 200 year flood return period, and they're the ones that we need to be thinking about in that wider view of decision making. Well, we need to upgrade the control room. Do we actually just move it or lift it up, or how do we mitigate that risk? So the solution prioritization process we did for the last regulatory control period, that was our third regulatory control period. We summed up all these asset risks, and we did various scenarios and looked at what was the alternative plan. If someone wanted to cut 10% or 5% out, what were the scenarios that we could do? What were the trade-offs? And we did that via asset portfolio initially, and then we had these cross-portfolio workshops. And just doing the process, we found money in the submission. We found, I think, probably 30-40 million that we could pull out because we'd gone through this process. And then we had a look at this other scenario where, what if we deferred these projects or took a different strategy on these projects? What would be the OPEX, CAPEX implications, the service implications, the risk implications? And we try and articulate that to our to the executive. But that is also very challenging for us to articulate that to a customer or regulator, because it's a monetized risk version, or 1 or 2 failures here, or extra CAPEX or resources. We have a real challenge to be able to communicate this, and maybe we need to talk about more tangible service impacts. Our service measures are how we're incentivized. So this is something that we also have to take into, like risk. Risk is service is a big part of risk. It's not just service. Obviously, it goes across public safety, direct cost, the environment. But these service measures factor in some of this stuff. And asset health is really like a leading indicator, and all the rest of these stuff like number of interruptions, duration, availability are often lagging indicators. Our performance has really been a credit to the asset class work that's been done. I guess the hygiene factors. We closely monitor our performance year on year. That's 22 years of data there of interruptions on the grid. At the top chart, insulation failure rates per 1,000 circuit kilometers in the middle chart, and outage circuit breaker fault outage. Sorry, outdoor circuit breaker fault outages on the bottom chart. And so we keep a really close eye on this, and that informs our reliability, our health models, because we can change expected lives, etc. And we also update our regulator on the performance. So how do we, I think the thing for both the risk management and the asset management plan is how we communicate with our customers around price quality trade-offs. We know value loss load is a problem. Monetized risk, people can't grasp what it means. So we've got some work to do in that area. And we're certainly developing more work around resilience and climate change, and more capability in options analysis. We've done some external scans too. Look outwards, try and find what others are doing. So we've looked across other utilities and regulators, and we've scored ourselves on maturity and looked at what areas we need to develop next. And so we had KPMG do an asset health and network risk report for us there. So what are our opportunities and challenges? Well, we've set a maturity progression. We were like RCP1 maybe would be 8 years ago, 9 years ago. We were at these yellow dots on level 1, primarily maturity definition on these assets for health and impact and network risk. We've moved in for RCP3, which is 3-4 years ago now, to these orange ones, and we need to push a little bit further, but only in the areas where we see there's value on maturing further. And this has formed part of a roadmap. These maturity targets, and that roadmap's really going to look at how can we improve our existing health models, doing a lot of work on conductor life extension modeling, getting some new health models for HVDC and reactive assets, reactive support, looking at impact, vol, a wide area and long duration outage. If there's an outage that goes for maybe 2 to 5 days, how do we monetize that, because vol is giving us really high numbers, and that will help build resilience business cases, we hope. And yeah, down the bottom, things around asset capability, reliability modeling, something that we haven't really been working on as strong as maybe other EDBs or transmission companies, and you know, getting into major hazards and climate change as well. I think I've touched mostly on risk service. I might be pushing for time here. I think I've got 3 more slides. How am I going for time, Andrew?
Yeah, we got about 5 more minutes, including questions, so maybe a little bit of a rush to get 3 more.
Yeah, sweet. I'll skip that one and just touch base on integrating our planning further. I think, you know, the asset class approach, the basics, the hygiene factor. We have seen a massive reliability improvement, but now what are we doing to look at network level, point of service level, and some of these other resilience aspects? Longer term, the challenges are, how do we engage and communicate with industry, with customers, with the executive and board, because it's complex. Getting all this data and massaging it and getting it into systems, and the fact that this is not an exact science, it's probabilistic, and that's hard for coming from an engineering background. You're used to more deterministic, more you know, right or wrong, or yes or no answers, and this stuff is definitely more probabilistic. Data quality is a challenge ongoing for us. And you know, I think there are things on risk that we're willing to engage with customers and other people and get feedback on, and then there's other things we may not, like public safety versus service reliability. So some of that appetite is ours, and some of the appetite for, say, service reliability, we need to take more cues from our customer on that as well, particularly when it's a trade-off on cost. So I guess with those challenges, I'll hand over for any questions or discussion.
Yeah, are there any questions from the crowd today? Julian's presentation there. I'm going to start you off on while we're waiting to come in anyway. Is you talked about just now the probabilistic events of stuff, and you talked about trying to estimate the cost of different events and all that sort of stuff. Have you done much looking into events that you've had compared to where you're pricing those events in terms of the risk and cost? So if you've had an estimate for price of an event, and then I don't know, last year you had a bunch of poles washed out in a river somewhere. Have you compared what you thought that sort of cost would be to where you're actually seeing them come in? Yeah,
we have a list of the really big events that Transpower have been involved with over the course of 20 years. And we know often some of those events have ended up in ministerial reports, and the costs have been estimated for New Zealand, the societal cost. And you know, we know some of the direct costs as well. So it's really interesting to compare what our impact modelling says to those costs.
Yeah.
And normally for those big events, our modelling is probably saying that there may be a bit higher. So we know that this vol issue is probably the biggest thing for us on large events.
Yeah.
So yeah, we do keep track of that, and you know, broadly, you know, 20, 40, 80 million have been some of the major events in terms of cost to New Zealand.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
there's not many of those.
Yeah, you'd hope so. Any questions from the floor, or I might just ask you another one?
Yeah, hi, Julian and Andrew. My name's Robin Pitwood. I work for PowerCo. Of late, I've been thinking about power supply quality. It's a job I've been given to do. It occurs to me that one of the big things on risk, we all talk about the big events of when the power goes off and the cost of power outages. I've been thinking lately about the events where the power doesn't quite go off, there's a dip and a bump. and those things have a cost as well and cause interruptions to factories, you know, for intermittent. And there's changes going on, as Julian points out, you know, there's changing to the nature of the supply, where the forms of generation we're adding don't add to the fault level. They basically don't contribute to fault current, and so the voltages vary more on the network where we have a low fault level. And also they're also sensitive to these dips and bumps themselves, and so we can have cascade outages of generators when there's a system frequency variation or voltage variation. So the grid is becoming more sensitive to these bumps, and we're also making changes that make these dips and bumps more bigger, and so the sine wave is becoming more impure. So there's a whole growth of risk area. It's pretty not noticed much yet, maybe, but I think it's another whole risk area which will need to be looked at carefully.
Yeah, I would agree, and I probably one of the biggest, one of the more comprehensive business cases and analysis I've seen on that was the WERNI, the Waikato Upper North Island reactive support work that was put forward. I can't remember the overall cost, but I think it's going to be looking like $100 million or something of that size, and that is really around addressing some of those issues around reactive support. And I find it is hard for us to model the consequence of some of that stuff, because the auxiliary market takes up a lot of that stuff. But yeah, how we look at that in the future, I think, is maybe getting more on top of our availability of equipment to manage that, and the health, and certainly some of the reactive support assets are getting health models in the coming years.
Righty, we're just falling a little bit behind now, so we're just going to push on. Thanks for the talk there, Julian. It's cool talk here. So our next talk's going to be, thank you. Our next talk's going to be on auto reclose for fire from Charles Lake. So Charles has over 40 years experience in working with control systems and IT systems in generation, distribution, aerospace, and retail systems. In his current role as control system manager with Orion, he is responsible for the team managing distribution management systems, load management systems, associated communication links, field RTUs, and remote operator consoles. So when you're ready, Charles, we're going to hand over to you here and get your presentation in.
Right, so thank you for the opportunity to present. My talk is going to be about risk in the small, if you like, compared to what we've heard from the last Andrews. So for me, it's directly into a small project that's about managing risk at that level. There's a couple of things about risk that I probably want to talk about, and one is that our internet firewall was changed last night, and there may be significant pauses in my presentation. So just bear with me as we go along doing that. So I'll just get straight into the presentation itself. Where are we? So I'm hoping that shows up for you. Effectively, we're going to talk about fire risk and the use of auto recloses. And this is a presentation that's been put together for Orion staff. So very directed into something that I delivered for the local team, and we'll talk our way through that and then see what comes out of it. So really the why is to reduce the risk that auto reclosing might start a fire when it's extremely dry. And I think that's the kind of hassle that over time we've been dealing with. It's really a balance of risks. So it's at a project level. So normally you're looking at the duration of faults and reducing those by deploying auto recloses. You're also looking at the safety
Hopefully we haven't lost him for too long there.
Users might connect a line that's connected directly to flammable materials. So this won't take long to go through. Basically an auto recloser, I don't think there's much that I need to go through with people, but you've got a fault current and it gets interrupted by the circuit breaker. Basically for a permanent fault, the auto recloser might pause for a period of time and then basically will attempt to close up the circuit again, fail, open, and try numerous times. At Orion, our rules are that we only auto reclose once, and that's about an element of safety that's been done by our safety by design process. Engineers have looked through the system and sort of said, what's the value in trying to auto close more than once? So in actual fact, for that area about permanent faults, we only reclose once, and then even then it's usually only for overhead lines and not for underground. Obviously, if it's a transient fault, you have the situation down below where it's you have the circuit breaker open. After a period of time, the transient has gone away and it will close and you restore supply. So you get quite a win on the ability to supply your customers. Our job, therefore, was to define what are we trying to do. It's basically measure the risk and enable or disable those auto reclosers. The how of doing it hasn't been a case of bringing us up towards asset management plans or overall company strategy. It's been basically one of incremental implementation and doing these within the business as usual teams that we have available within Orion. And obviously, when we're assessing this, we've got the function of doing the job, but we've also got to consider the other items of what does this mean for cyber, the elements of risk of the wrong thing occurring because someone can now get into your system, the resilience that's applied in here, and to make sure that whatever we do is done in a good, resilient manner.
We might have lost Charles there.
Just make a few phone calls. Hang on.
Okay, we had a question come through from someone for Julian. Maybe we'll just jump back and ask that while we're waiting. Are you happy with that, Julian? You're still there?
Yeah, I am. And Gurjeet, I was trying to type up an answer. An interesting question.
I'll just read it out just so everyone knows what we're talking about here. So we got from Gurjeet, we got, hi Julian, great presentation. How does the pandemic like COVID-19 impact is captured in your resilience cost estimate and its impact on resilience plans, etc.? I believe there is room for learning in case. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So I think, I mean, a lot of our impact modelling is about unserved energy and business interruption and the cost of the interruption, be it business like commercial or industry or residential or agriculture, and that cost of interruption is sort of actually been met through COVID lockdown. But I think the impact modelling is probably like it is a longer term thing. So I think with New Zealand's GDP likely to bounce back in the coming year, I think it's a temporary thing. So yeah, good question. The impact to New Zealand would have been less for this year for sure. But I'm fingers crossed that value of lost load, that business interruption cost goes up next year in terms of how the economy bounces back. We've just kept the value of lost load, and it is site specific. So when we develop a value of lost load, we develop it based on the customers that are hanging off that GXP or grid exit point. So we haven't made any revisions down for this year, but the thinking is that it should bounce back. Fingers crossed.
Righto. I can see we've got Charles back. Are you Are you a bit more solid now, Charles?
I can't say that it's going to stay there, but I'm
Okay.
willing to give it a go. Where did I get up to?
Yep, sweet as. We lost you at the end of, I think, your second or third slide there. If you just flick through, we'll tell you where you were.
All right, so if I just go back.
Yep, back past that one. Yeah, I think we had you at the end of your next slide. I think you were just finishing off the slide here and your assessment of resilience sort of space when we lost you.
Okay, so this is the website that gives an assessment on fire risk, and it's basically been put together by the fire service in collaboration with NIWA, who published the website, and they distribute information sort of saying what the risks are in each area. As we can see there, the risks are low, and at that stage we would leave our auto recloses enabled. If we go to another date, we can see that the risk is becoming high, and so we should consider exactly what we're doing with the auto recloses on a basis of that. If the risk gets too extreme, we would definitely disable our auto recloses. So it's a case of looking at the assessment. It's not a very easy thing to do for the fire service. Sort of implication you see is usually on the side of roads. You'll have indications as to fire risks that are occurring. So it's related to that sort of information. It says it's unstable, so we'll keep working. Can you tell me if I can still be heard?
Yep, we can hear you at the moment.
Okay, you probably heard the bollocks as well. Okay, so we'll keep going. One of the things we have is that our lines don't coincide with the fire service assessment. So obviously a transmission line will go across many of these districts. And so the complexity occurs in that the assessment has to include the worst case for where those lines occur, or which districts they're going through, and actually affect the auto recloser appropriately for that. I am going to skip through this reasonably quickly. This is really the sort of complexity that we end up with on a control screen. So if you're looking at the control system, we can show all of the auto recloses. Now, initially, this was done by selecting each individual component and turning it off or turning it on. And so that you can imagine the amount of work and difficulty with that. We then started to group them into district areas. But again, it was still done on a manual basis by district. And so over time, we've switched from a process of saying, oh, we'll do this for the summer, or we'll do this for an extreme dry period. And now we're moving step by step into doing it based on the information that's available to us and can be printed through. And so now the end game of this has been to automate it. And we've been able to sample what's on that website and bring it all the way through and actually affect those controls automatically. Many of the auto recloses that are shown individually on that screen actually occur in multiple areas. So they actually occur across more than one district. And that's because there's no one-for-one matchup with what the fire service sees a district and where our lines go. And in actual fact, they changed their mind partway through this over the last several years. And so we've actually had a stage where we've had to regroup all of this and redo it. So yeah, the outcomes are that over several years, we've moved from a sort of set and forget status. It's now manually set, or it was manually set on a seasonal or a regional control setting. It then moved through a desire to be more responsive to actually trying to do this on a daily or even an hourly setting. So we'd find that we would be setting it and disabling auto recloses during the day and then re-enabling them at night. But now we can actually bring that information in and automate it. So effectively, the fire service assessment of the power line risk is queried, and it's applied to each auto recloser based on the highest risk. What do you need to do this sort of work? And there's a skill around deployment that was mentioned by Andrew before in any project, whether big or small. But it's quite interesting having the conversations with NEWA and the fire service and whether they actually want to be accountable for informing us on this. And so there's a kind of legal conversation that goes in there as to they're publishing that information, but do they really want to be tied up with someone who uses it for a specific purpose? And so it's quite nice to actually have that conversation rather than just use it without their knowledge. But that was an interesting conversation. Website services are not always reliable. And so it's interesting to work through the resilience and reliability of taking stuff off a website service and using it within a control system. There was this element of actually being careful with firewalls and cyber risks and making sure that we had the right process for delivering the information through. I think Andrew also said that one of the things that's occurring is your information systems and control systems and the risks on them. We're becoming more dependent on those systems, but we're also seeing quite an increase in risks that is occurring from that sector. Finally, your control system service and application level has to be a lot more than just here's the control system and this is how you deploy it and this is how you maintain it day by day. You need some in-depth understanding of how that control system works. And so you're looking for experience that's beyond the norm in that control systems area. You need to actually build applications that will work effectively in areas that weren't designed by the supplier, because the supplier didn't have mechanisms for doing that. It's both a strong information technology, but also strong operational technology experience that's needed. And to get this done, you need perseverance. This didn't happen over a period of a year. It's been many years implementing it. And it's been a case of desiring to do it in small steps, change the scope, either in timescale of what you're doing or in geographical area of what you're doing. Our next steps, we've still got more to do. We want to actually get some experience with using this, measure the outcomes in terms of what it meant for SAIDI and how often the fire service triggered a change in behaviour for those auto recloses. In actual operation, do we have any defects? Does it work well? Do we have interruptions or resilience processes in there? And we have improvements in mind already around the architecture for the system. So one is about improving the cyber security of it. Another one is about making it more resilient to failures and faults. And at the moment, it's not a true automation job. It's actually just a scheduled implementation. So it's still time-based in terms of looking for this work and doing it. So we run it every half hour rather than when the information actually changed on that website. There's a big thank you, and this is because I presented within Orion, but I want to make it clear that it takes quite a few people to even get a small job running. So it's the asset managers, the engineering teams, the controllers who actually use it, those OT experts that you need, and to some extent, occasionally a commitment from senior management to go and get it working. So that sort of push is what's needed. Bringing it back to a discussion about risk, I think you've got this element of the supply of electricity, and so you have a SAIDI which squeezes you in one direction. You've got the people risk from auto closers, so Orion uses a process called safety by design, and that's to make sure that we don't put in place something that's actually a risk to people or the systems that we're using. For the environment and the public, it's really bringing back that element of fire hazard. And as I'm saying, it's about moving beyond electrical engineering and supply into what does it mean for community and the kind of effects you get in there. And then that other risk is really the implementation one, the complexity, the range of skills that you need. And to some extent, the supply chain, both within your own company, not everybody sees risks the same way. And certainly when you go to other companies, it's interesting to have a discussion about the risks of doing something and what resilience they expect to see from it, or what implications it might have as you talk to a third party about you using their information for a specific purpose. and whether they want to be part of that. I want to stop there while the link is still intact, and I'm happy to take some questions.
Sounds like a safe place to start there. We've got a couple come through, so I'll just start off with the first one that came in. So from Josh Butterell, hi Charles, by automating the auto reclose blocks based on the data by the fire service, how will this impact on maintenance activities, e.g. vegetation management?
The answer to that is that maintenance activity still has to occur. So the automation runs in the background, but it doesn't override any tags or blocks that are put on systems in order to do normal maintenance. So when you want to do your maintenance work, you do that as normal. What you've got to do and make sure when you're putting in this automation is that you're not overriding the safety around maintenance activities, etc. So they work together.
Okay. Another one from Chris Knight's come in. Hi Charles, in a previous role we used very similar NIWA information to disable reclosing for extreme fire risk areas. I have two questions. First is, when you say disabled, do you set to single slow IDMT trip or do you default to fast instant trip? They say they chose the latter, taking a view this reduces fire risk at the most, although it does increase outages.
We did the same as yourself, so probably for the same reasons as counties. Orion also decided that if the risk was getting high and in that area of extreme, then we would definitely work with a fast instant trip and no retries.
And the second question you had was, have you taken any other fire risk reduction steps? We looked at gas fuses, but wanted to justify this based on a longer term view of NIWA data. The web portal offers here and now, but not a longer term view of fire risk areas. Did Orion achieve this?
So not in terms of asset changes from my point of view, because I was just looking at the control system and how to do the best thing with that. In terms of asset changes, I'm not aware of changes in there, but we do keep looking at it. In terms of long-term fire risk, we can get sort of week ahead estimates from the NIWA modelling. But in terms of the very long climate change or other views on that risk and its implications on asset, I don't have any view on that. So yeah. I can't say about Orion achieving that or not.
You get thanks from both of them, so you seem to have answered the questions pretty happily there. Julian Morton said there's a longer term view of fire risk from Scion. That's what he's saying to that.
Yeah, thank you for that, Julian.
Are there any other questions from the group? Feel free to type them up or unmute yourself if you want to. Otherwise, I'll go on for you.
And I apologise for the interruptions. That's just part of the fun and games of this.
We're still got about 5 minutes, so we're not crashing for time or anything. You mentioned that the fire service gives you these distinct districts of risk and fire, and your lines sort of override them. Do you think that the fire service considers you guys a major contributor to fire danger at all? Do they see you as that?
In our discussions, no, it wasn't as though they were likely to rearrange their assessment. Their assessments are quite complex and they're based on geography, if you like, and they're based also on the vegetation growth and the use of the land. So there's an awful lot of geography involved in how they assess that. And they have quite chunky areas that you might have seen on the graph. They probably had a lot of debate themselves as to how to best model what areas were fire districts. And I don't think they really saw the power line element as being a major item. But I wasn't there for that discussion. What I did find was quite interesting was the whole thing about we're going to use the data off this website and we're going to affect our controls. And they were quite intrigued by that, and then they wanted a legal opinion within their own teams. And in the end, they were quite positive about it, but it's well worth having that discussion. I think.
Yeah. So do they, in their terms of view, do they consider that more of a personal use thing rather than a private? You know, they don't expect Orion or similar anyone doing infrastructure sort of level stuff to use it. Is that what you're saying there? Or?
Well, I'm not sure, but off the record, they're well aware of the kind of insurance claim that came against Orion because of the major fire. I think they wouldn't want to be an interested party in that. And so it's all of that sort of thing I think they would work through. I'm only guessing as to why that fitted into their thinking, but it is quite natural that there are consequences from how we apply our systems and how we apply our controls, and the world is becoming more complex on that front, and we're going to have to grow up with it. And that's why I think it's quite relevant to talk about the computer risks or the IT risks that come along and are part of the equation now of supplying a utilities infrastructure.
Yep, for sure. Alrighty, any other questions coming from the floor? No, I think we're just about on time again now, so that's great. So cheers for that speech, Charles. It's quite interesting to see that that side of things, the fire management side of things. Always a bit exciting to hear someone talk about fire, even if it was in a purely risk management sense. So the next presenter is going to be Richard Kingsford. He's talking about WELL's ISO 55000 journey and challenges. So Richard has 20 years of experience across the industry in both planning and operational roles. In his current role, he must manage existing assets for the current environment while understanding the impact of new technologies, changing landscape and expectations. Working in WELL brings the opportunity to forecast future network and DSO requirements, then use both technologies and cutting edge technologies to address these requirements. So when you're ready, Richard, we'll pass it over to you and we'll get your presentation.
Cool. Hello, everybody. Just scrolling through some of the names there, and a lot of familiar names, which is pretty cool. It is a shame that we can't be all in the same room and then share morning tea or a few beers afterwards. But I've got to thank EEA for bringing us all together so that we can still keep a little bit of community. So that's really good. Well done, EEA. Thanks very much. Today we're going to talk about ISO and WELL's ISO journey, and ISO has been a hot topic around the industry. So this may be helpful to some to understand or help clarify some of their own thoughts. For some, if you're from, say, Unison, then you can just sit back and smile smugly at your own journey and the good work that you've done. My role at WELL is Asset Planning and Engineering Manager, which is responsible for building the AMP, the network development spend, and the maintenance spend, and also refining some of the maintenance processes and how we go about measuring, understanding our works and planning our forward work. So when it comes to WELL's ISO journey, I'm a lot involved in a lot of the planning and processes, and ISO will impact me probably the most in the business. One thing to think about is just cast your mind back, and has there ever been a time when you feel like your boss has been diving too much into the detail, really getting into the nitty-gritty of what your role is and what you should be taking care of, and maybe they should be further up, sticking to a dashboard and sticking at the overall picture? Conversely, have you ever been that manager and been having to dive into the details because someone that is reporting to you is not giving you the information that you need? It's not speaking the right language, or it's not presented in the right frame. I know I've been in both situations, and in fact, sometimes I'm in both situations at the same time, and that is kind of awful. So that brings us to what WELL wants to get out of ISO 55000, and one of those things is clearer communication, better separation of tasks and responsibilities, and documented processes. And that's going to help us to understand where we should be talking, how we should be communicating, and hopefully help us to avoid some of those situations. So we'll run through that we'll run through an example from well, and then we'll talk just more broadly about well's journey towards ISO 55000. So let's kick off. I love a bit of Dilbert cartoon, and don't take this as my personal opinion on whether this is true or not, but I just wanted to use this as a talking point to understand that this is not just a process to get a tick in a box, especially for well is compliance is not the goal. That's Well's goal is rather to enable our communities to thrive. This is our values, our vision for the business, and the process of going through and aligning or accrediting to ISO 55000 is another tool and another enabler for us to get our business humming, make it more efficient, more effective, and that ends up with our customer in terms of being able to deliver to their wants, to their needs, and do it in a cost-effective manner. So everything we talk about here and everything that we're doing is really with this in mind. So into the nitty-gritty, clear communication. So ISO provides a framework for us to talk to, so that when we're talking at each of the different levels, whether it be at business cases or we're talking about the justification for the asset management or asset replacement strategies, we're talking the same language. So we know what to expect, we get the alignment, we meet at the same point, and it helps all of those conversations. And later on, I've got a bit of an example with a presentation that was made to support our spend profile for the AMP, and it's been presented to the exec level, and it will go to board level as well. And that just gives people the context and the confidence that we're going through the right process. So when we talk about those separations of tasks and responsibilities, we're explaining this process and how we get through, and that will give management the confidence that they don't need to dive into the detail, that they can let the people that are responsible be responsible and take ownership of those elements, but they still have the control and they still have an understanding of what's going on and the confidence that they will get the right information at the right time, and they'll be able to understand that they can mitigate and manage risk and manage budgets. So this process is basically a gap analysis process that we use for our network development planning. So we talk about security criteria at the start for our GXPs. That's an N-1 security, and as we go down through the network, that security gets towards N, or even just fixed when it breaks. Likewise, with that security criteria, that could be a health and safety criteria. It could be an environmental criteria. And then we run that through a gap analysis to identify our gaps, which we do in our network planning documents. Then once we create projects to address that, there's obviously an optioneering process in there, followed by a decision on which project we're going to implement. We then scope that out with timing, and that becomes our spend plan. Following that really goes through to management approval. We create something called a PDD. It's a project description or definition document. That is our DFA for the scope, the timing, and the budget, and those go through into our AMP. So management they shouldn't really be diving into, although I invite them to talk about it, but they shouldn't be going into the projects or when the projects occur. The impact there should be at the front in the security criteria. You set that, we agree what you want as an outcome, then the engineers will work through and come up with a really, really good plan on how we're going to deliver to that. And then at the end with that spend plan, if you want us to work faster, we can work faster, we can slow down, we can manage versus budget, we can take more risk, we can take less risk. But that's a case of we've ranked our projects as most important to least important, and we can work through that in order and then just debate at the start and the end rather than debating the minutiae in the end, in the middle. So that's quite powerful for us, so that we can remind people where the attention should be. And likewise, this goes both ways. So when we're reversing it and we're communicating up, we want to communicate this security criteria. And at the start of this process, before we just alakazam come up with a spend plan at the end, we should be agreeing the security criteria. Is this still where we want to aim for? That security criteria, that should come from stakeholders in the end. So WELL has recently developed a way of understanding our stakeholder requirements and then documenting those. That will then lead through this gap analysis and through this process as a general process. So the benefit here, separation of tasks and responsibilities, so that people know what they're doing and they have autonomy within that zone, but everyone knows the checks and balances that will occur through the process. And so we're confident that we'll get, and when we get to the spend plan at the end, that it's not an unexpected spend plan, it's met the criteria and that communication has occurred throughout the process. This is something else that gives people quite a bit of confidence in terms of how we're delivering that gap analysis or any of our processes. And that's the fact that during the ISO framework, we do have this act, plan, do, check. We do have a number of feedback loops that they're creating. So when we're looking at if we start at the end, so at do, everyone understands do. So that's where we execute the plan and we manage the resource timelines and projects. And then we're going to check the performance. We're measuring, when we executed our plan in the day-to-day management, did we mitigate the risk and gain the SAIDI or cost the SAIDI that we expected? How did those projects go? So we have a day-to-day management framework here. But we're also feeding back of the long-term performance of the network. So when we looked at the performance overall for faults, etc., are we feeding that back to understand and alter the way we manage our assets? Is there a tweak we need to make to the measurements that we make with some of our assets? How about our asset replacement rate or our strategy? Or is there a network configuration that is required? And lastly, that should feed back to the overall performance and whether that meets the stakeholder requirements. Is there more budget required, or is there do we require a greater outcome in terms of the performance and where those conversations should occur? So we have a separation of tasks, but then we also have checks and balances to make sure that we're achieving what we said we would do. This again, Dilbert, I do donate every year because I do tend to use as cartoons. And this is really just an example that we often have these processes that are so complicated that no one can really understand what people are talking about. And I'll give a credit here to an old colleague at Becca, Steve Salmon. He had an amazing ability to take very complicated themes or topics and explain them very, very clearly. And that's because he knew exactly what he was talking about. And when I get into a situation where I kind of know what I'm talking about, I probably would benefit from looking it up again and refreshing my memory. Then I find that I'm jumping around a little bit in how I explain something to someone. What we want by having documented processes, and this is an example of one of WELL's, is that we're very clear in our communication and we're very clear about what we're doing and where it goes, because we can refer to where the process and where the information flows. The second benefit of having these really well documented processes is that when we know where the data or information must end, then we know the format that it will be in. And for us, all our data is stored in SAP. So as we go through the process, we should be refining everything so that the data can flow nicely into SAP. So SAP has some requirements in terms of even the format of numbers or how characters and things are expected. We can then build that into our process all the way through by having this nicely documented process. When we know how things fit together and how the planning work will feed into the design, planning and delivery phases, then we can provide the right information to them. So when we've designed our processes most recently, we've treated the design and delivery people in our organization as our customers. And we've made sure that our process is building up the information that they needed. And through those conversations and through documenting this process, we've been able to provide a much richer data set and provide information that was easy for us to gather at the time, but saves the planners and designers a lot of time and effort later on in the process. So you get that once you've documented your process, and it's amazing when you try and document your present processes, how you often kind of get lost, because there's we know we start here and we end here, but there's a fuzzy part in the middle, and that's where you're often getting conflict or loss of information or a poor flow or poor outcomes. So it helps document your processes. It's a key part of ISO. So for well, and from my point of view, for well, most especially, the caveat here is that all of the information here is my opinion, unless it's a really good one, and then well can claim it. So if we document our processes and we have those clear responsibilities, then we do align our thinking and we get clearer communication. And that means we get less guesswork, less iteration, wasted effort and frustration. So all those frustrations from that first cartoon of not having the right communication or that micromanagement can disappear once we've got a clear understanding of where we're going to meet, how we're going to talk, what information is going to be provided. So that's some of the key things that I hope to, and I hope well, will get out of our ISO 55000 journey. So that's what we've talked about so far, those clear communication, separation of tasks, documented processes. Now gonna step into Well's journey to ISO 55000, where we're at and what we've found so far. Should say that at the start, we're at a point where we've been aligning and we're at the point where we've done our first gap analysis, and we're about to decide how fast, how far, and we go with ISO. So, but as I mentioned before, here's an example of how we're able to have clear communication. So this is how we break down our spend, and we can break our spend down from asset replacement, net development, down into the maintenance and down into that orange box with our what we call our annual works list, which is basically our asset replacement for poles and conductor things, cross arms, things that are that there are many of. So if we do a substation design, it'll be a network development. But when we're talking about replacing 100 poles and 1,000 cross arms, we create the annual works list. We can then jump into the process that we run to do this. So this was presented so that we could give the exec team the confidence that the numbers that we were coming up with were sound and fit, and that we should proceed with the budgets that were suggested. So two sides to this flow diagram. If we start on the right, we run our condition-based risk maintenance profiles. I'm sure you've run the same, and that helps us to identify our 10-year budgets. So our spend profile through the 10 years to mitigate risk. Now, we agree those and agree the risk that we're going to mitigate and the outcomes in terms of safety and outages that we expect from that spend profile. More on that in a tick. And that will define the first year of budget. So the year that we're about to go into, this process defines our budget. To the left, our process is that we take an understanding of our assets in distress. Now we determine that through desktop studies with CBRM. We take our notifications, which is people in the field telling us we've got issues. and then the desktop study. So that's the engineering analysis, and it's most applicable to things like transformers or ring main units, where you're reviewing your engineering data, maybe oil results, and you're coming up with a risk score from there. We take that information and we break it into chunks, and we now break this into outage envelopes. So if I'm having an outage for one of these assets, I want to make sure that I do all the work that needs to be done in the next 3 to 5 years in that same outage. So we don't want to come back and have those same customers out. So we break our whole list of works into these outage envelopes. We then rank them for risk and the benefit per dollar. So the amount of risk that we can mitigate per dollar, that's how we rank them. And then the top ranked items, we go out and we scope. So we get an indication of long and lead items, if there's any access issues, whether things need to be done in summer or after cropping, or if there's any health and safety concerns that need to be considered during design, landowner issues and things like that. So that scoping helps us to refine our price, and it helps us to refine the risk and cost. So from there, we re-rank our items, and we might have a bucket in this prioritized work list, and it might be 10, it might be 12, 15 million, and then whatever our budget is in that rank for each of the asset classes, then we let that amount of work out. So with this process, we always have work in reserve. If someone was to come to me and say, you've got an extra $1 million this year, I would have the most effective jobs to complete at my fingertips, because I have the jobs where I'm mitigating the most risk per dollar for our network, and that's the best outcome. One caveat to this is what I call the Canadian geese theory. It's a Kingsford theory. I like to come up with my own theories and then name them. But this sort of says that no matter how many customers or what the risk value is, eventually you just have to do some jobs. In our case, we had a lake with a number of Canadian geese, probably 100, 200 Canadian geese. And they used to wake up in the morning and then fly straight into the sun. And we had one of our distribution feeders right there, and they used to smack into that. And there was only 8 customers down this line. 3 of them were pumps. And so not a lot of SAIDI impact, but we were having multiple outages to this line, and the upgrade was $100,000. So from a SAIDI point of view or a risk point of view, it kind of doesn't make much sense. But the Canadian geese theory says that you eventually have to do something about these items, and so when we go through this annual works list, we still allow for items like this where there comes a point where either the asset will fail and we need to do it on health alone, or there's some overriding factor like our Canadian geese where we have to put the line in delta or make an arrangement or a change. So, but this process describes how we go and form our 10-year budget, and then how we choose the jobs for next year. And then as part of that process, this is what we presented to the exec to give them confidence that our $7 million replacement is right sized. So through our CBRM process, we could show what we would expect at the number of failures. If we run $7 million for 10 years, this is how many failures we'd expect in our 10th year. And this is the total. This is the fault cost, and that includes vol and replacements, all those sort of things. And that would be the SAIDI from unplanned outages. Now, if we were to add $1 million, we reduce the fault slightly. Now, we've changed the balance of the project slightly, so the numbers, you do have to understand a little bit of background, and the detail is always there, right? But we can see that we do have a small benefit from increasing $1 million. We save 400K in fault cost, not a lot. SAIDI comes down slightly. However, if we were to reduce our budget to 6 million, then our fault cost has actually gone up. It's gone up by 1.4 million. So our overall cost has gone up. We tried to save $1 million per year, but overall it's costing us more. And through this analysis, you can see that there's a nice U shape of this. If we could run more data points, we'd have more of a U shape and be able to optimize this to a finer degree. But this is the sort of thing that tells us that we're in the right ballpark for the spend that we've got with the present information and the present condition. So nice way of communicating, nice and clear. Then we've got our budgets and we've got a way forward, and then we're going to manage the nitty-gritty of the projects. We're going to measure our risk, we're going to measure our SAIDI, and we're going to compare them to what we thought they would be. And management can sit back in comfortable situations and watch the dashboards and know that everything is under control and that they don't need to dive in, which is good for everyone. Right, quite an involved diagram, this one, but this is where well is on its ISO 55000 journey. So pretty much our last slide here. And this journey really did start 5-6 years ago as the business moved from a break fix type of arrangement to a time when it really valued the AMP, and we began CBRM, and we started really looking into how we are going to maintain our assets, and the maintenance really stepped up. Now, what kicked off our ISO journey before ISO was even talked about within the business was when we were about to move into mobility, i.e. the tools were such now that we can do a lot more with our cell phones and our tablets, etc. And so when we were moving from that, we took the opportunity to update our maintenance engineering specifications, our standard maintenance plans, i.e. what we measure. So when we moved from our old system into something that's mobile, we didn't want to repeat all the same, I'll call it poor measurement points, but it was overly complicated and confusing. For example, we had 100 different test forms for transformers, when really a lot of that could be culled down to 6 different test forms. One for the very big zone transformers, one for large ground mount, and then one for the rest, or 2 for the rest. So we run much less forms. We've got much clearer. The standards are nice and clear. It runs nicely through. So we've created that process for how we update these. We can update any assets. We can incorporate any technology by running through this process. And we are running through our assets. We started with transformers, ring mains, and those most common. And we expect to be finishing that process in about 8 to 10 months. So that's where we've run through that process, and that helps us to update our SAP data and what we're collecting, which again feeds back into CBRM, etc. That brings us kind of through that phase where we were aligning to ISO. So these processes, the feedback loops and everything we're creating, they align to ISO. And at that point, the company said, "Hey, we're going to go down an ISO journey," and we said, "Great, this is fantastic. We're on our way." And with the CEO approval and swinging in behind, in fact, charging, we now have more resource, etc., and dedication to pushing this process, which is fantastic. So where this takes us, we think, is that we've done these processes for the planning, and elsewhere in the business, they've done the execution processes, but the integration comes from ISO, where we're going to coordinate and tie these processes together. So end to end, right from start to finish, that's where we hope to be. And we hope to get CBRM integrated into what we do, so that, for instance, if a guy is out doing an assessment of a pole out in the network, I would like to take that updated condition information and run it quickly through CBRM, and then back out to the field so he knows the risk that item is. In fact, he would then get a prompt to say, "Hey, this is in such poor condition, it's definitely going to need to be replaced in the next 5 years. So while you're standing next to this pole, can you tell me exactly what we should replace it with?" And that's the process. So at the moment, we would bring that data back, and then at one time of the year, we would run that, and we would say, "Hey, we need to go out and understand do the scoping for this asset. Whereas if we can integrate CBRM and these processes together, then we don't need to revisit, we can do it at the same time. And then other processes to complete and drive towards ISO is getting our strategic asset management plan, the overarching link from our regulatory asset management plan back into our stakeholders, agreeing those objectives and what we want to achieve. So that's a big part. And there's some other processes that come into here. So including that we've got a whole of life cycle costing, and then creating the dashboards so that we can provide the right information up and start to communicate in a better way. So this end date, it's aggressive, it's achievable, but the main thing from my point of view, and it's solely my point of view, is that we take ISO journey as a tool for us to update these processes and get that alignment. And I think if we do that, then we get the true benefit out of it. So there we go. So in summary, those clear communication, documented the process so everyone knows where they are and where well is. We're currently aligning, we've got aggressive targets, but it's worth noting that everyone's journey is different. So, and our journey might change as we progress. We might change our speed. We might change the depth to which we go to. We will see, but at the moment, pretty excited by where well is heading. It certainly helps me in my role. It helps me to understand and communicate within the business. It helps to have more intelligent conversations. And I hope that through providing this framework and getting ISO embedded within the business, that I can do a better job and letting my managers know exactly what's going on and when things will occur. And then that communication will keep their minds at ease, and we're all on the same page. So there is some time for some questions if people have something more intelligent than these people to say.
We've got a couple of minutes, so if anyone's got any questions, feel free to fire them through. I'm muted, put them to the chat. And while you're typing them or getting ready, I'll just give you one now. So you talked about a fuzzy point in the middle between communication and planning, where ideas aren't quite communicated to each other properly how they're meant to. Do you think that's like an inability of people to follow the processes they don't fully understand? Or do you think it's just purely a misalignment of communication, like you were saying? Where do you think that stems from?
Yeah, multiple factors. So I think it's a misalignment. It's also because over time things change, or there's an expectation that is understood by a person, and then that person moves on. For us, we had a guy that used to look after the network development for 10, 12 years, did a brilliant job. So good, no one even needed to know what was going on. And recently he had an opportunity to, his daughter was going down to Dunedin, so he moved. And we had to define the process and really think about how that is done. And as part of our understanding that we were going to be moving to ISO, we wanted to document that process. So it wasn't that the process was poor, it was just the fact that it wasn't documented. The other part is for all of your processes, you should be considering how your data flows along that process and how it's handed from one to the other. So, and we've found that sketching out our processes and understanding that data and rethinking about data is one of the key outputs. We've done more than just get to the engineering answer, if you like, or the data that, we've thought about how we can cleanse and control our data in our SAP system. So
cool. We've had a question come in from Julian here. I really like the presentation, especially the Canadian guest theory. A bit like the hygiene factor, where something needs to happen even if it's slow. On the SAIDI numbers, the different spend, how did you get feedback from stakeholders on different SAIDI or cost trade-off scenarios?
Yeah, so this stage that's gone to the exec. It'll go to the board. So we presented to them with the spend that we have, and very much in that form of, you could spend an extra $1 million and you would get this answer, or you could spend $1 million less and you would get this answer. There was an expectation that we would fit within certain bounds, so we already had that as a guideline. Back to stakeholders, there is an engagement once you go back to the community of what that level will be. That's always quite difficult. What we find is that our urban city areas are reasonably happy. Our rural areas expect the same performance as the city, but aren't willing to pay for it. So it is a tricky situation. So at this stage, we're trying to do the best across the network and really managing against spend as a conversation. I understand there could be wider conversations, and we're really excited by what technology could do in this area.
Cool. Sweet as. Carl Rathbone's just saying, perhaps Canadian geese theory equals uncosted risk value exists. Same for hygiene factor, so pretty similar to what Julian was saying, I think. We might just call you there because we're pushing into the next presentation's time. So thanks for that presentation, Richard.
All right, thanks everyone.
Cool. And we're going to move on to David Lynch now, who will be talking about maintenance strategy review. So David is based at Huntly Power Station, and after graduating from the University of Waikato with a Masters in Engineering, he began his career with Genesis Energy and has since gained a broad exposure to both thermal and renewable generation assets. With Genesis, he has held various engineering and asset management roles and has recently been involved in leading asset management, process safety, and maintenance strategy initiatives across the Genesis asset base. So when you're ready, David, we're going to pass it over to you for your presentation.
Cool, thanks Andrew. I'll just share my screen. Let me know if you can see that.
Yeah, that's looking good there.
Cool. All right. Well, thanks for the opportunity, everyone, and nice to meet you all this morning virtually. Yeah, today I'm going to talk about some of the journey we've been on around maintenance strategy reviews within Genesis. Not sure the attendees here. I'm assuming there's a large portion of you from distribution and network companies. So and just hearing from Richard's presentation that I guess the journey towards ISO and the maturity around maintenance you've all got is probably pretty well defined. I think in generation have sort of somewhat of a different prospect where we've got, I guess, a broader range of assets, which can be a bit of a challenge at times. So anyway, I'll run through the journey we've had to date and what we've been focusing on and some of the benefits we've got out of it. Feel free to jump into the chat and ask a few questions as they come up, and I'll get to those at the end. So yeah, for us, you know, asset management for us is doing the right things on the right assets at the right time. You know, and obviously maintenance is a big part of that, not just replacements or upgrades, but maintenance is a key part of getting the most value out of our assets over their life cycle. So today I'll give you a bit of a background to this initiative and this work that we've been doing. Cover off the problems or the current state that we're in, what we're trying to address. Go over, I guess, the framework and the processes that we're using to review our maintenance strategies. Talk about how we have implemented or are implementing this. It's still a work in progress, and go over some of the benefits we're getting out of it. Just, I guess, for those of you who may not be aware of our asset base, just briefly, we've got a thermal power station in Huntly, which has aging plant, Rankine units from commissioned in the 80s, which two of which is still in service, as well as newer gas turbine plant that was installed in the early 2000s or mid 2000s. We've also got 3 hydropower schemes spread across the country at Tongariro, Waikaremoana and Tekapo. And we operate and maintain all of these schemes. We've also got ownership of a small wind farm and partial ownership of a oil and gas field in Kupe, but we don't maintain those assets ourselves, they're contracted out. So it's just the generation sites that we're focusing on here. Our asset management journey to date, similar to Richard, in that we are using ISO 55000 as a target, working towards that and aligning our systems and processes to that over the past 5 years. Again, no clear decision that we want accreditation. We've recently completed an external review to give us confidence that we are close if we were to decide we wanted accreditation. But yeah, so a lot of our systems and processes are set up and aligning with that. And using process safety is a key part of that as well, with equipment bow ties to identify and manage risk. So part of our asset management system is we have asset management plans and maintenance plans defined by our different equipment types. And as I mentioned before, we have a lot of different equipment types or asset groups. So I think there's 46 across all of our fleet that we've split our assets into. Those are really defined by the different technical governance that those equipment types require. We have a technical engineering team who are technical authorities for various bits of kit, and depending, regardless of whether an asset is a transformer, generator transformer at Huntly for a thermal unit or for a renewable unit at Tongariro, the asset management of that asset type in terms of the life cycle strategy, the maintenance carried out, the testing and performance of that is common. So it's our approach is to align into these different groups where there is commonality of asset management. And that, I guess, works well with a clear accountability for that technical governance. So each of these groups has developed boundary diagrams for each of those, which just further clarifies what's the scope of each of these are, and broken down further into the components of that group. So in terms of maintenance of the assets within each of these groups, the current problem is around defining and understanding what is done on these assets, and a similar but separate question is what should be done. So a lot of our assets have been in our ownership for many years through ECNZ days and the evolvement or setup of the various companies that exist today. But a lot of our staff at these sites have been there 20-30 plus years, and a lot of that knowledge is inherent in people, and what is done on the assets is not always well defined and not well captured, and it's kind of quite hard to get a picture of everything we do on an asset. When we look at our maintenance management system, we use Maximo. There's information in PMs and the job plans which are associated with those PMs. The job plan details might have long description text. They might reference attached documents or inspection sheets or check sheets or procedures. So when you're trying to review what maintenance is conducted on a given asset, it's quite varied where to find that information. And to date, or up until this work stream, we haven't really had a clearly documented documental process to say this is for this asset group or this asset type, these are the maintenance tasks and the intervals that we should be completing these on. So that's what should be done, and as I said, it's not always well defined. And if we're trying to, carry out a continuous improvement journey where we're trying to constantly review and update and optimize our maintenance, how can we do that without a clear base for where we're starting from? So that's what we're trying to work towards with our maintenance strategy reviews, and using those to develop documented maintenance plans. The reviews really process is 2 steps. And the first part is developing FMECAs, and I'm sure you're all probably aware of what's involved in that. But that's really understanding the different equipment types, the components we've got, the locations we've got them, how they fail, and what are the risks of those failures, and therefore leading to what are effective maintenance tasks to mitigate those if necessary. So that's step 1, is developing the FMECA for an equipment type and publishing that as a maintenance plan. Step 2 of the review is completing a gap analysis. So once we've got that basis for what we should be doing, is then reviewing, okay, what's in Maximo? What are we actually, what work orders are we generating? What job plans are we using? What frequency are they occurring? And do they align with what our standard should be, or what our standard is? And now that we've defined it, we can use that to conduct a gap analysis and make any required updates to ensure there's alignment. And that alignment between the strategy, the maintenance plan, and what's executed is an ongoing piece, where if we make a change in one area, it should go back and forward to update the other. At the moment, it's a bit of a manual process, but we are looking at tools which have a bit more, not automation, but alignment between the tools in terms of how we capture the FMECA, how that flows into job plans and into Maximo, to try and make that process a bit easier to manage and keep that alignment there. As I said, I'm sure you're aware what a FMECA is, but if you're not or haven't had exposure to it, it's really understanding, as I said, how the equipment can fail, what's the impact of it, and then how can we mitigate it. So having that documented in a FMECA allows you to go back and use it as a basis for if you do want to review or make changes, or staff on site are questioning, why are we doing this task? We do it, we're doing it monthly, we never see any issues. Or why don't we do this additional task? You can come back to the FMECA and you can use that as a basis for that discussion or for that review to say, okay, well that task is supposed to be preventing or mitigating this failure. And then you can really challenge that and say, is that the case? Is it an effective task? Are we doing it too often? Or if it's not effective and never going to identify or prevent that failure, then what value is it adding? And maybe it can be removed. But having that FMECA there is a useful basis to set the scene and to conduct and capture that review is really useful. And trying to keep those as living documents is a really big, good benefit out of what we've been doing. And working through the FMECA, again, we're using our equipment boundaries as the defined area, and trying to work towards FMECAs for each of those equipment areas. We break down the components and go through failure modes of each of those. What maintenance task you complete and the frequency, and then we're just using Excel spreadsheets as templates at the moment to capture these, but we've got a lot of additional columns in there as well to help that thinking and that thought process, where we capture the failure cause, the mode, is it a rapid failure, is it a gradual wear, and some of that criticality and consequence analysis covers, if it was to fail, does it have a direct impact on generation? Does it have any environmental consequences? And also things like, are there plant redundancy or hidden failures? So understanding that can really help you to work towards defining an appropriate maintenance task. And in doing that, there's also other things to consider around regulatory and statutory requirements, but really understanding each of your failure modes can help to define an effective and appropriate maintenance task. There's tools that you can use to help drive that discussion and lead to a good outcome. But it is really about discussing it and having the right people in the room, the guys with the experience, the guys with the technical knowledge to lead to a good and practical outcome. Yeah, as I said, there's tools and there's diagrams you can use. No tool is perfect, but some are useful. So there's not one I think workflow that, or tool or workflow that you could use that's always going to be appropriate, but they do help to get the thinking of the people involved aligned and working towards useful outcomes. And often in terms of defining the maintenance intervals, there's a lot of complicating factors. A lot of our plant, we require high availability, and it's probably no different to network companies. So often the frequency is defined by other factors and opportunity outages. So you might have statutory or regulatory requirements requiring certain plant is taken out of service for inspections of pressure vessels or the like. And that means that, you might have a large outage every 4 years, and then a lot of other maintenance tasks then get grouped with that frequency just because the opportunity is there and it makes sense to do it at that time. And piggyback on that outage rather than defining their own outage every 5 years or 6 years potentially. So lots of things to consider, but yeah, trying to capture it all as we go has been useful. I probably won't go through this in detail, but this is kind of the process we've been following to run through these reviews. Obviously, we targeted the start of this review process. We targeted assets with the highest criticality, the highest consequence of failure, and planned around that. There's a lot of data we collect prior to running the review workshops around recent failure history, historical data sheets, historical RCMs or failure mode analysis that have been completed to help input and inform the reviews. And then really it's been working through that FMECA spreadsheet as a workshop with the right people in the room to develop what we call a maintenance plan. And these align quite closely with our equipment asset management plans. So an equipment maintenance plan for us uses the same equipment boundary, gives a result of that FMECA in the workshop as a strategy overview, defines those critical maintenance tasks and intervals, also captures critical and emergency spares, which are often an output of the FMECA, where if a failure mode can't be mitigated, spares are often the maintenance strategy. Captures the maintenance data that we actually measure and gain from carrying out the maintenance, so that we can use that to build accurate health models, so that we know for an asset type what data and insights we're actually collecting and recording. At the moment, we're still on a journey to make sure that all that data that's captured is usable in a digital format rather than handwritten check sheets scanned in and attached. We want to be able to capture that at the point and make sure we can use that easily to trend and input into our health models. it also captures historic expenditure, and we're working towards predicting, better predicting our future spend on maintenance. Covers support contracts, any other improvement initiatives that come out of the workflow, and links to other components of our asset management system. So our EAMPs, I don't know if may have been presented in other presentations in the past, but they're a 2-page A3 document, and our maintenance plans are the same, where it's really a consolidated summary of the FMICA, of those outputs, and what is ideally a usable, workable form. So throughout the program, we decided how to tackle these, and it's always hard to get the availability of the site staff, but to make sure we were making progress, and rather than just chipping away at it, we decided to use a agile sprint-based methodology where we get the right people in the room for dedicated week to focus on developing that FMICA and publishing the maintenance plan as that first step. And the gap analysis would then continue outside of that. But actually, that was quite a good way to do it. In the ones we've done to date, it's been a really good way to make progress. Often people are busy, and if you chip away at things, it can drag on. So yeah, that dedicated week to tackle a defined problem with a defined output of the completed FMICA, completed maintenance plan has been really good. To date, over the past 12 to 18 months, we've done about 15 asset groups, and that's the FMICA, that's the maintenance plan published, and the gap analysis are ongoing. Yep, so I think I've kind of covered that within the week, developing the FMICA, the maintenance plan, and we also use it as an opportunity to review our bow ties, which cover process safety aspects of our equipment. So what are the major failures or significant events? What are the threats that could cause that? And we capture as barriers or controls that we have in place to prevent those failures occurring. Maintenance is obviously a key part of those prevention measures, and making sure the right maintenance is being done mitigates those risks of failures. So we use that as an opportunity to both review and update the bow ties, as well as make sure there weren't any gaps in the FMICAs and the maintenance that we had defined through them. As I said, the reviews and the gap analysis, the updating of the PMs and job plans in Maximo has probably been one of the most challenging parts. It's the fact that across the multiple sites, the structures of PMs, job plans, they're all quite different depending on how the sites have historically used the CMMS, and there's, I guess, ongoing work to try and standardize and get consistency in our PM and job plan structures and standards around what fields are used, naming conventions, all that sort of thing, which means that, yeah, over time we'll get there, but at the moment it's still quite hard to do that gap analysis and make those updates. Other ongoing actions out of this is around some of the new initiatives identified. So we took the opportunity through the FMICA to say, is there any new technology or new devices or tasks or analytical models that could be done to, I guess, improve the maturity of our maintenance, move away from time-based maintenance through to online monitoring. And those sort of opportunities often you can't solve in the day in the workshop, but you can identify those and continue to work on those outside of it. So there's been a lot of work for us around analytical models. as well as new technologies such as drones for underwater and aerial inspections. As I mentioned in the workshops, in that week, we've got the technical authority as well as site operations and maintenance support. It's really critical to have those people involved. They're the ones who know the failures that have been having, the experience of when they do a maintenance inspection or task, what they find, whether they think tasks are adding value or not. That challenge is really important, to have that as well as the engineer oversight to say, you know, this is the theory, this is the best practice, and facilitating that discussion and capturing the output of the decisions of the FMECA has been really good. And then, yeah, a lot of the benefits we've been getting out of it has really been to challenge current maintenance practice in certain areas. You know, it's just, you know, it's what historically has happened is what continued to happen. The focus always goes where there's issues, but there's often, you know, big gains or big improvements to be made as things change over time, in reviewing what's actually happening. So as well as, you know, the addition of new technology and the ability for predictive analytics can really help to, I guess, remove some of the manual tasks that may have been needed in the past, but with these new tools are not so required. So yeah, I mean, through the analytics and digital work streams, we've got, I think, aerial and underwater drones at all of our sites now. So just having those and using them to, I guess, displace other tasks, you know, has been really valuable. Removing the need for divers, removing the need for scaffolding, that sort of thing has helped improve, I guess, the efficiency of how some of the tasks are being done. The whole process of, I guess, and defining that, like Richard said, that grey area of the process of developing maintenance and getting from a point to say, this is what we do and why we do it. That big gap in the middle has I think, really been filled by this process to a good extent. Yeah, and ongoing reviews. So like I said, you know, using the FMECA as a basis and going back to it when plant operating conditions or modes change has been really useful. I mean, recently we've had a example at Huntly where due to marking conditions, we've been, I guess, relying on the coal plant a lot more than we have through periods in the past. And, you know, that change or that swing in availability and requirement from that plant has led to, you know, a lot, I guess, a higher degree of wear and failures in the maintenance team there, really feeling like they're struggling to keep up. So going back to the FMECA that was done and re-reviewing it for the current conditions and expectations, it was really good to have that there as a base to work from. Yeah, so it's kind of most of what I had to share today. Hopefully it was valuable to hear that, and hopefully you've got some questions for things that I may not have covered, or yeah, I guess when you're working in it, it's hard to know what you've missed or what other people are going through.
Yep, definitely. So we'll open up for questions now. We've got one come through from Robin Pitwood. So, hi David, is the increasing level of non-governor controlled generation causing an increase in the maintenance costs of the governors and or generators that respond by reducing and increasing to compensate for the coming and going of the non-governor generation?
I'm not sure if I can answer that one. If you mentioned in my intro, my background is mechanical. Can I get it? I don't. Yeah, sorry, I can't answer that. I mean,
A little bit outside scope.
Yeah.
Yep.
Sorry.
Yeah. So there's. If anyone else has any questions, flick them through. Maybe you can put them on someone who might be able to answer the question from a bit better internally. Maybe David.
Yeah. Yep. I can do.
Any other questions coming through from the group? Just personally, have you found many cases where once you started doing that process of documenting what people were actually doing, you found a few spots where there were actually just work that didn't really need to be done, or was just being done in an effective or an efficient way? Did you find many specific cases of that?
Yep. Certainly examples of staff who had the experience and knew what needed to be doing, but when you look at the job plans, those tasks that they were saying were done were not actually defined or captured in the system.
Yeah.
So, yep, very good at closing those sort of gaps. Yep.
Yeah. You've had one come through from Todd Trotman as well. Has Genesis had support through this journey, or has it all been internally led?
Internally led for these maintenance reviews. Yep. I guess relying on industry experience and input from others, but we haven't had any external facilitation or anything like that. Other than I mentioned earlier this year, we had an external review for our asset management maturity and alignment with ISO. So some of those gaps has fed into work streams, but internally led. Yep.
One's come through from Julian Morton. Did you find cost savings and or areas that were not being appropriately maintained?
Cost savings was a hard one. Initially, there was a lot of focus or a big desire to try and show where we had been making cost savings. We certainly had removed some tasks, and across the schemes there were tasks that were completed on similar assets every year, and on another scheme that might be every 2 or every 4 years. Sometimes that came down to condition, but sometimes that was just the standard for the site. So determining a Genesis standard helped lead or defer some of the maintenance and lead to cost savings there, as well as assets not being appropriately maintained. Yeah, I guess maybe not appropriate, but the opportunity to improve was definitely identified where, yep, we could do some simple tasks to improve reliability or improve the knowledge we have of condition. So, yep.
Sweet as. Any other questions coming through? No. Cool. Well, we're about time to finish, so we'll just call it there for you, David. Thanks for the presentation. It's a good one.
All right. Cheers, everyone. Get in touch if you have any further questions. I'm happy to chat.
Yep.
Thanks.
So that's going to bring an end to day one of the forum. It's a great day. We heard from Andrew Smale, who gave us a good discussion of what our AMPs are, or what they should be, how we need to communicate our thoughts so that they are useful and to the people that can see these plans. We had Julian Morton, who looked into the decision-making process for risk management and some of the frameworks he's been using. Some good thoughts on how to communicate risks as an economic quantity, which is always a useful tool when we're dealing with accountants. We had Charles Lake, who spoke about Orion's work into mitigating fire risk from their auto reclosures. Although we lost a bit of his presentation to the Zoom tax, we still got some insight into working in situations where useful information we have doesn't quite line up with the assets that we control. We had Richard Kingsford, who talked about Wells 55,000 Juni. He looked into how managers and the people who prepare plans can respect the separation of their roles through clear accountability and communication. He also let us in on the Canadian Geese theory of economic management. We had David Lynch, who spoke on Genesis's maintenance strategy review. He looked at how to transfer the inherent knowledge of assets that staff have and the work that they complete into a more established framework, and how this framework can be useful in reviewing work streams. So some great presentations there, great ideas about asset management plans. And we've all learned a lot about risk management as well. So the asset management group would like to thank you for your attendance, everyone that's here, and wish you a great afternoon. The next session is on the 2nd of December, and it's going to be about planning for a low carbon environment. There's a great lineup of presenters from New Zealand, and we've also got Nigel Wilmont in from Australia. He'll be talking about the growth of PV over there. So you'll be sent an email that links you to that next week's one some point before then on how to join it. So thanks to all our presenters and thanks to everyone who came along. Enjoy your afternoon. That's today finished. Thank you.